Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, we're back with another Survivor 20th Anniversary Retrospective. This time, we're talking about Survivor Marquesas, Season 4 of Survivor US, which is a very important season for the show. I mean, it is the most dynamic season gameplay-wise up to this point. It is the first season to have a major flip after merge, which should pave the way for how the game is currently being played. The cast here is for the most part strong, with certain players playing in a way ahead of their times, though at the same time the cast does have a few forgettable figures and some people that just are unwilling to play the game for a decent amount of the season. But despite those things and some mundane episodes here and there, I do still come out of the season with a pretty positive outlook on it, similar to the way I look at Survivor Africa. Now, like my other retrospectives, I will be running through the season from beginning to end. So let's start off with the premiere, where we do get the old school style of intro, where Jeff names every player on the cast and their tribe. And along with that, we also get footage from home, which is again, always a nice personal touch that I liked from these earlier seasons. They do make a big deal on this season about how they're back to the beach, with that even being the name of this premiere episode, which is all kind of ironic considering the fact that the season was supposed to be filmed in Jordan up until the events of 9/11, which stirred them away due to political unrest. But it is kind of humorous how the backup location for that was the Marquesas here, as from what I understand, I mean, to this day, the Marquesas is one of Jeff's and production's least favorite locations to film in due to the amount of bugs that they had to deal with while out there. And just from watching the season, you can tell from seeing a lot of the bug bites that everyone had along the way. Another thing propped up in this episode is how little supplies the players were given here, with this being the least any cast has been given up to this point, though it did seem like they're still getting more than what you would get on a modern season of the show. We do see the tribes rowing the camp, where at Maramu we do get the classic Sarah Cleopatra scene, which is, a fine moment. I mean, to me, it is more memorable as being the introduction to Sean Rector as a character, who really is incredible across this season, and he is the one that gets to narrate this entire scene and does it in a pretty fun way. Though this obviously does also start Sarah's storyline about how she's lazy and how she doesn't do anything, with her obviously being the only one to not help with the rowing of the boat here. We do also see the instant bond between Sean and Peter Harkey, which I would have liked to see this throughout the season. I think it would have been a fun relationship to follow, though obviously Peter doesn't survive this round. Well, this is also where we get introduced to Rob, who would later be known as Boston Rob. Obviously one of the most iconic figures in the history of the show, and his first confessional here is him talking about Peter and Sean being off their rockers. And this one confessional does a great job at introducing us to Boston Rob as a character here, with him spending the entire season giving these really cutting confessionals, while also doing a great job of talking as if he's talking directly to the audience, which I do think he does better than possibly anyone else in the history of the show. I mean, like, especially up to this point in Survivor, with him reminding me kind of like Dr. Will in Big Brother, who excelled in a very similar thing on that show. We do also get introduced to Hunter, who immediately comes off as the leader, and instantly do see Rob's rivalry with him, where he orders Rob around and talks about him being unfocused on the survival aspects. And again, we get this great scene of Rob helping carry rocks back to camp just from the drop a whole bunch of them along the way. But through Rob mocking Hunter and Sean talking about how he doesn't want him as the leader, I mean, Hunter really becomes the first major example of how important the social strategy elements of the game are here, especially in comparison to the survival elements, which is something that he clearly didn't get, and is something that I feel like the general audience didn't get at this point in the show. We also get introduced to Vespia, the winner of the season, who does get a bit of a strange premiere here, especially in comparison to your typical winners at it, with her getting no real personal content here and only being on the show to talk about her observations of others, with her pointing out that Sarah and Rob are in a showmance, and she gets this great confessional talking about how Sarah has a great body and paid a lot for it. And really, Vespia does have some fun lines throughout the season. It really does make me question why Jeff considers her so boring. Jeff's been very open about not liking Vespia and not wanting to see her play again, and I personally don't fully get why. But as I mentioned, we do also have the Sarah and Rob showmance in this episode that does become a major storyline on the Maramu tribe, with Sarah being a possible target in this episode because of their relationship. And really just Rob's relationship with Sarah is kind of just strange in retrospect, considering how he obviously later meets Amber on Survivor All-Stars and marries her. And again, he clearly treats Sarah way differently than the way he treats Amber, with him clearly looking at Sarah as more of a fling than anything serious. And he openly talks about that on the show. Now on the Road to Tribe, I mean, overall, I do feel like Road 2 is a bit more boring and definitely get a lot less focus in the episode, though we do get introduced to Kathy, who gets the first really notable journey edit over the course of the season, where it starts off here on the outs after being looked at as too domineering around camp. But obviously by the end of the season, I mean, she ends up being one of the most impressive players we had seen up to this point in Survivor history. John Carroll also gets a decent amount of content, with him being the first to start the fire, and he clearly comes off as the leader of his tribe here, but is also pretty prominent in vocalizing how aggressive Kathy is around camp here. We get to the Muni challenge, where we get the return of Quest for Fire, which I believe this is the final time it's used until Survivor All-Stars, despite being a tradition up until this point. And I believe this is actually the last time it's ever used on a newbie season. But Road 2 starts their winning streak here, sending Mauramu the tribal. And on Mauramu, we get a decent amount of content about Peter Harkey, who is a pretty fun character here in the premiere. I mean, he gets this really notable moment talking about his holes and needing awareness of your holes, to which Rob obviously gets the opportunity to mock him in confessional. But beyond him as a character, and Peter also seemed to be one of the most active players in the game here, where we do hear about him wanting to strategize over who to vote out, and the tribe seemingly gets upset at him for wanting to do so, particularly Gina. And while yes, it is a misstep for him to be very openly saying this in front of the entire tribe, I do find it humorous how he becomes the target here for simply saying that he wants to play the game. Now, we do get some talk about potential Sarah or Patricia boot, but we get the tribal, which was hilariously short. And the vote itself is pretty split here. I mean, Peter goes for Patricia, Sean and V go for Sarah, but the rest of the votes do end up landing on Peter, who ends up being the first male first boot in the history of the show. And his boot here actually starts a trend of abnormal moves that end up being made on this season based on how the show had been perceived up to this point, and largely due to how dynamic of a game a lot of these players were playing. But with that, let's talk about Peter himself, who, again, I love as a first boot here. I mean, I always found him to be a pretty fun character, with him getting a decent amount of character moments for a first boot here. I do think he was a player a bit ahead of his time, where he did seem to have a full understanding that this is a game, which clearly some of the people on his tribe didn't fully get. But at the same time, he didn't seem to gel socially with the majority of his tribe. And while he does seem like someone that would be a potential first boot on any given season, I do think it would have been interesting to see him get another chance and to see him actually be able to play the game. Now for episode 2, which starts off with more of the same storylines from the Row 2 tribe, with John still taking the lead and hunting for a pig, which he ends up saying that if he finds one, he's guaranteed Final Four, which is obviously how the game works. We also get talk about how this is the love tribe, with Gabe really leading the charge on that, and the only person ruining the love tribe here is obviously Kathy, who again has the same storyline here in her getting into confrontations with John and Gabe over her abrasiveness, and Gabe is upset that she isn't trying to be one of them. And we get the start of his I'm just trying to create society storyline that really ends up dictating his entire role on this season. But really the main intrigue here is once again on Mauramu, who is just straight up again the more interesting tribe here. And right away we get a great character moment with their morning show, where it's really just the tribe having a lot of fun. I mean, they're cracking jokes, they're singing, dancing. Sean gets a lot of content during this, really showing how great of a character he is. And all of this is pretty fun. Patricia also gets a lot of content here, despite her being like near invisible in the premiere. I mean, like Hunter talks positively about her, and we get introduced to her nickname Mama. We do also get this like humorous scene where Hunter puts sun lotion on Patricia, and Rob is just there yelling out that it's nasty, which is obviously brilliant social play from Rob on this season. But a lot of the rest of the content about her is more negative, with her also coming off as abrasive, just like Kathy, and Rob and Sean being really annoyed with her, which does set up her boot later in the episode. We do also see the Sean and Vespia relationship where they bond over their backgrounds and talk about how they're perceived to be aligned just because they're black, and also talk about the struggles of being black in the game of Survivor. And all of this did feel ahead of its time and are very in line with the conversations about race that the show is currently having. Though immediately after that scene, we get a segment about how lazy Sean is, which definitely felt like they were just undermining the conversations that they had just shown. We do also see more of the Rob and Sarah showmance, with that putting a target on Sarah's back again, but this time more so where Hunter explicitly talks about getting rid of her to make Rob more productive, which again just continues Hunter's storyline of him looking at the game as a game of survival over a game of social strategy. Now, I did also find this episode bizarrely structured as well, where like everything I just talked about was before the reward challenge, which starts around halfway through the episode, and we really just rush through the reward and immunity challenges, where the immunity challenge is a gross food eating comp, where we do get a notable moment from Boston Rob where he struggles to eat the fafaru and loses the challenge for his tribe. Now, we do get minimal content before Tribal here, where Sarah does continue to be targeted after annoying Gina while building the shelter, and Hunter ends up approaching Rob to tell him to vote Sarah out, and you can clearly tell that Rob is not on board with this plan, and he proceeds to go to Sean, and they agree to take out Mama, leading us to Tribal, where Patricia is voted out in a 4-3 vote. Where it is funny that she does get votes that just call her mom, which is, again, humorous nowadays in conjunction with the Sierra voted out her mom memes. But this vote, again, shows how dynamic this season is, where Rob puts together this alliance to flip against the perceived leader in Hunter. And while, Patricia herself isn't necessarily someone that you wouldn't expect to be an early boot, I do think the way it happened here is definitely unconventional, especially at this point in Survivor history. But with that, let's talk about Patricia, who is mostly a forgettable figure on this season. And really, outside of her being called Mama and that sun lotion scene with Hunter, there's not really much to remember about her. She really doesn't get much time to talk on the show, where most of her screen time is other players talking about her, and most of that stuff is negative. And the storyline that she does get here is simply one that we've already seen before, and one that we will continue to see from these older women who get targeted pre-merge. That happens constantly over the history of the show. Well, now let's move on to episode 3, where we do get a fun return to camp segment of Sarah arguing with Gina and Hunter over them voting for her, and Sean ends up joining the argument as well, and Vespia gets to narrate this scene. And this is the first time she ends up saying her pretty notable line of "there's too much drama," which she says across the entire season, which is something that I personally don't get why she's upset that there's so much drama, considering I feel like her game is benefited so much from other people having conflicts, while she's just kind of there in the background. But again, whatever. It is also funny how, obviously we have this massive argument, but the very next scene we see from them is them doing another morning show, to where it feels like everything's just fine between them at that point. We also get a segment about the no-no bugs, which again was a major annoyance pertaining to the filming in that location, but it does lead to a fun joke from Sean talking about the differences between white and black no-nos. Road 2 in this episode is a bit more interesting, where we get the first sign of Kathy's evolution, where she starts to get along with her tribe, and Gabe gets a confessional to talk about how much he loves Kathy now. We do see the Pascal and Naliah relationship for the first time, which becomes really important moving forward, especially from a gameplay standpoint, but from a character standpoint, they really just feel like a retread of Roger and Elizabeth. And to me, it's just not as likable. But also here we do get one of the more iconic moments of the entire season, where John ends up getting stung by a sea urchin, and while coming out of the water, he yells, "I need someone who can pee on my hand." And this entire sequence is just hilarious, especially with Pascal being the first one to try to pee there, and he can't do it, so then Kathy jumps in and does so, and it's just a ridiculous scene, but it is a lot of fun. It also starts a string of injuries for Row 2 in this episode, where later on we see John get bit by an eel, the general ends up cutting his foot as well, to which John ends up getting some personal content here, talking about him being a nurse. Once again, this episode is structured pretty weirdly, where we don't get the challenges until really late once again, though part of that is because we get a lot of camp scenes revolving around the reward. As earlier in the episode, we do have Jeff going to the camps and giving them supplies to make a raft, which they end up using for the reward challenge, and this leads to a lot of content from Hunter, who gets his downfall edit here with him being annoyed that the opposing alliance is treating this as a vacation. And he constantly talks about the game, again, as a game of survival, and clearly just doesn't get it. And we follow this up with both Sean and Rob talking about how they're targeting Hunter. And Rob in particular gives a really interesting confessional here where he ends up having this really great observation on the game of Survivor, which is all kind of ironic because he's describing the type of game that he doesn't typically play, where he talks about him being the small guy, and the way to play the game is letting the big guy lead and you taking advantage of the big guy's mistakes, which is again a strategy that we've seen numerous players execute over Survivor history, and it can lead to success, this idea of like actively playing passively until it is the right time to strike. And it is what Rob does here right off the bat on his first season here. But really, his game from like the Patricia vote forward throughout the rest of Survivor history is him being the big guy, the one that is in charge, and the one that other people are hoping he makes a mistake that they can take advantage of. I mean, to me, again, it is interesting to me to hear Rob talk about ideal Survivor play as essentially playing the counter game to the game that he ends up playing moving forward in Survivor history. Afterwards, Row 2 ends up winning immunity once again, with this now officially being the biggest immunity streak in the history of Survivor US up to this point. And I mean, at this point, it should be pretty clear that either Gina or Hunter are going home. And we do get talk from Hunter about how stupid it would be for them to vote out him or Gina. And we do see Hunter campaigning to Rob, which was clearly ineffective. And right before Tribal, we do get another iconic confessional from Rob, now actually outlining the game that he does end up playing moving forward, where he talks about how he doesn't care if his tribe is strong as long as they obey, and talks about fear keeping people loyal, which again is the strategy that he does execute from this point forward. And again, the way that Rob articulates the game through this episode is something that we just simply haven't seen before. I mean, while Rob's strategy here isn't too dissimilar from something we've seen from Silas from Survivor Africa, the way he's able to articulate it here adds an interesting level of strategy that had been mostly missing from the show. And I think shows that even back then, Rob was already one of the better strategic thinkers that the show had ever seen, though realistically also has a similar fatal flaw to what Silas had back in Africa. But afterwards, we do get to the vote where we do get this massive blindside at the time where Hunter is voted out here, where it seemed pretty clear that Gina and Hunter thought that Gina was going home. And again, the audience seemed to as well, with this being the first time that a tribe has voted out their perceived leader this early on. I mean, we had seen it from Borneo where they vote out Joel, but again, that was at the very end of the pre-merge. Here, we're on episode 3 and they're voting out Hunter, which again, I could definitely see the backlash to it, considering again, they're a tribe that has been on a losing streak here, and voting out your physical strongest competitor is not really the ideal move. But to be honest, to me, the choice between Hunter and Gina is pretty interchangeable here. And like, to be honest, like, even though this was like a massive blindside at the time, it's like, if you pay attention to the edit, it feels pretty clear that Hunter is being set up for a fall here, to where from like an Edgic standpoint, it should not be a surprise by the time he goes home. Hunter does also get some pretty fun, bitter final words where he calls the entire tribe knuckleheads, and he talks about how he doesn't get the logic of them voting him out. But again, I do think this is a clear lesson over how physical strength and survival skills aren't what's important in the game of Survivor, and it really is the social relationships and alliances that will carry you through the game. But with that, let's talk about Hunter, who to me is a really memorable figure due to what his boot signifies within Survivor history. But even beyond that, I did find Hunter to be an interesting figure for the show, and one that clearly doesn't get the game itself, thinking that him being a survivalist was going to get him the win. But despite that, I did think he brought some entertainment to the show, largely through his relationships with others, through his rocky relationship with Boston Rob and his interactions with Sean and really his entire tribe. I mean, again, Hunter was a major source of conflict for them in the early portion of the season, and his arc over the course of the season is such a major storyline up until this point. Well, then let's move on to episode 4, where we do see the ramifications of the Hunter boot, with Gina starting to get this underdog edit that really lasts until her boot. And mostly through these next 3 episodes, she ends the season as the pre-merge boot with the most confessionals in the history of Survivor US, which is a pretty insane stat, especially considering, like, again, I don't find Gina that entertaining. On Road 2, we do see Gabe reestablishing that this is the Love Tribe before we get to the tribe swap, which ends up breaking apart his Love Tribe. I mean, this is actually only the second swap in the history of the show. And interestingly, I mean, this season was filmed during the airing of Africa, to where I believe the first ever swap aired right before the start of filming here. So this was still a very fresh concept, and it's handled in a radically different way than it was from Africa, where this is the first ever like truly random swap, where in Africa players volunteered to go on a journey, and those that volunteered ended up being the ones to swap over. But here, Jeff just told everyone to stand on a disc, and underneath it were the new buffs for the tribes they were going to be on. Now, something I did find interesting about this swap here is that it does happen at 13, which felt like a weird number to do it. And also the fact that we get tribes that are of the same, and the fact that we also get tribes that have the same number of people in them from where they started, which gave Rotu a massive advantage here with them still having 8 people, while Maramu was left with 5. And the swap itself doesn't play out favorably, where Maramu gets all of the quote-unquote weakest physical competitors there. But I do find this overall scene to be pretty fun. I mean, we have the first person to flip over the disc being Zoe, and just to see how pissed she was when we get the reveal that it's a swap is pretty funny to me. But really, the swap also does just end up screwing over Maramu even more, where both tribes end up with a Rotu majority. And once again, we do see one tribe being more interesting than the other. Maramu here is essentially a redo of the Love Tribe minus Gabe, with Gina fitting right in with Kathy, Pascal, and Naliah, while Sarah is clearly on the outs. But again, this does lead to a lot of content for Gina, with her narrating most of the scenes there, talking about how much better it is to be with these people than her old tribe mates. And along the way, Sarah gets negative content relating to her not helping around camp. Rotu is again the more interesting tribe here, and we do get V narrating the initial scene after the swap, which from an Edric standpoint would have been a good sign for her, with us instantly getting to see her reactions to how the swap played out. Though realistically, again, like V's winner edit isn't entirely there for most of the season. But this is also where we get what is now a really notorious scene, where Boston Rob has this really cutting confessional where he talks about each of the Rotu members one by one and roasts them along the way. And while parts of this still do remain pretty funny, I mean, again, like he calls Gabe a brainiac. He says the general has a little sausage. I mean, after mentioning Zoe, he just says, come on. But his comments, particularly about John, have not aged well at all. I mean, him calling him a big time queer and how he won't be sleeping next to him. Again, like, not great. Later in the episode, he calls him a girl, and there's like just more ickiness moving forward about Rob's homophobia here. I do think is the biggest stain on Rob's legacy on this season. But Rob does get more content even beyond that, talking about how much he hates his new tribe and how everyone here is workaholics, which is kind of ironic considering how upset Kathy was at the old Rotus due to how lazy they were early on. But him and Sean don't even try to integrate within the new Rotu tribe here, which does eventually lead to an argument between Sean and Gabe, to which V once again says that there is too much drama. But again, this is a part of the game where, I mean, I will give V some credit for her adaptability. I do think she does a much better job at relating to the Rotus, and then Rob and Sean, who again just do nothing. Vespia at least attempts to get along with them. And while it isn't super effective by the end of it, to where had the game played out naturally, she's still 8th on their pecking order, I will say that I do like the flexibility that she displayed there. Another thing to note here is how well I feel like Tammy was playing on this tribe, where Tammy seems to be the only one that Rob has nothing negative to really say about. And we see her bringing Rob and Sean food, and really, I think all of this is pretty indicative of how strong socially Tammy was on this season, and really how decent double player, Tammy was. But really, this is another episode with a pretty late immunity challenge, with the new Rotu unsurprisingly winning it. And through that, Sarah ends up getting voted out unceremoniously without her really seeming to do any real campaigning. But with that, let's talk about Sarah, who I think is mostly remembered nowadays for her Cleopatra scene and also her being Rob's first showmance. I mean, outside of that, she really doesn't do that much. I mean, she doesn't seem to be actively playing the game and really is just following whatever Rob is doing most of the time. I mean, she seemed like a pretty big outlier on her swap tribe and didn't really seem to have much of a chance there. And most of her content on this season is based around her laziness and weakness around camp. Now, I do think she is the first of her archetype to be on the show, where she does feel like a departure from most of the other younger women that have been on the show up until this point. But again, she wasn't really portrayed in a positive light over the course of this season. Now for episode 5, which is an episode that mostly revolves around Rotu and is way better for it. I mean, again, for me, the new Madaramu is just so bland outside of Kathy. But most of their screen time here does end up going to Gina, who again is on the bottom and continues to bond with the likes of Pascal and Naliah. But again, Rotu is where all the main intrigue is happening here, especially since they end up finally going to tribal by the end of the episode. The reward challenge is for a tribe raid. And normally, I mean, who cares? But Madaramu gets their first win here and essentially is able to take everything of worth from Rotu, which ends up harming Rotu in the immunity challenge, which in this episode ends up being the SOS challenge, which already felt like it favored Madaramu as it is inherently a very easy challenge to rig. But even outside of that, Rotu had nothing to build their SOS with, so it isn't that big of a surprise they end up losing. But on Rotu, we do see Rob talking about V being a good butt kisser, with her trying to bond with the original Rotus, which again, we get from Rob's perspective, which I do find kind of weird that we never actually get to see Vespia herself talk about what she's doing here. But the majority of the great content that happens on Rotu here does revolve around John and Gabe, where we see the old Rotu get together, where John is clearly trying to get the Rotu to agree to stick together moving forward, but Gabe just won't commit to it, despite him ending up being pretty loyal later in the episode. I mean, he talks about how he isn't there to play the game, and he's there for the society that they had created. And all this is really just actively bad gameplay from Gabe. Again, like, despite him not wanting to play the game, he is still fundamentally in a game. And this just makes him come off as untrustworthy. And John even gives him a second chance afterwards, and he is still in committal. And all of this just makes John target him from this point forward. Gabe also has this notable bad rapping scene where he's literally just saying words that are associated with the survivor. But the scene does make John even more sketched on him, based on the fact that Gabe is spending so much time with the old Madaramu members, which leads to John going to the other Rotu members, one by one, to secure their loyalty, and in turn creating the Rotu 4, which obviously ends up playing a major role in how the season plays out. And even beyond that, John is now worried that the old Madaramu could pull in Gabe and cause a tie. So John ends up going to Sean to try to pull him in, but Sean instantly realizes that this is a mistake on John's end. So Sean and Rob end up trying to work together in order to try to flip Gabe to their side. And we end up going to tribal without really any follow-up on that. Though in reality, it does seem like Gabe probably ended up just rejecting their offer and went back to John, as it does feel like John definitely knows about what happened here. That does end up causing a lot of drama in the next episode. But Gabe clearly knew he was going home here by the time of tribal, and he ends up getting voted out here unanimously, which in a way felt like a wasted opportunity for Rob to take back control of the game. But again, I just never felt like Gabe was actually considering flipping to Rob's side at this point. And really from this point forward, Rob's fate is essentially sealed, with him literally having no runway left in the game, where on this tribe, he's very clearly the next one out. He's down in numbers, coming to a merge situation. He has no numbers left. And that is part of the major fault of Rob's game in this season, is him having voted out the stronger players in the game. Then at the same time, it's like they just straight up lost immunity challenges, where he voted out the strong over guaranteeing that he had numbers. But I mean, realistically, it really all came down to immunity challenges. Like, if Rob comes into the merge with numbers, he's definitely in a much better spot. than he is having lost those first 3 immunity challenges on Maraamu and then losing Sarah after the swap. It's like there was really just no runway left for Rob here, and I don't think it really works out for him in most situations. Before moving on, let's talk about Gabe, who is a strange figure in Survivor history. Again, another weird casting choice in the fact that they casted someone who clearly didn't want to play the game, which even by Survivor 4 feels like a relic of a casting choice. If he was on Borneo, it would fully make sense, but by this point, even though the strategy of Survivor was relatively simple, it felt that even by Australian Outback, it was well acknowledged that this is a game and that there were alliances that were needed to be made to benefit your game. So again, Gabe being on the season is a bit bizarre. Even going back to Hunter, who I don't think understands the game, he at least looks at it as a game. He just doesn't get the reality of the game. Gabe does even look at it as a game, which is the weird thing to me. So because that, Gabe is a notable figure to me, but mostly because of how misguided he was while being on the show. Now let's move on to episode 6, which bizarrely starts with us getting new content in the previously on, where we see Rob's voting confessional from the previous round, where he calls out John, which I don't believe is something we've ever seen before, and I don't think we ever see this again. But on Road 2, we do see the general of all people talk about how he is using John as a meat shield, which, again, definitely not something you would have expected to see from the general. We also get a retread of Rob talking about how he's losing trust in Vespia, her talking to the Road 2s, but really, the Rob-John rivalry ends up taking up the majority of the content on Road 2 in this episode, where Rob clearly is on the bottom now. He starts to go all out and openly asking the Road 2s if they have an alliance, to which he ends up getting into a fight with Zoe, where, again, Zoe comes off pretty poorly here, with her, talking about how they have a friendship but not an alliance, which, again, feels very much just like a technicality. John straight up admits to having an alliance, but is then able to turn the tables on Rob by calling him out for trying to flip the vote on Gabe in the previous round, and all this is pretty fun. They eventually make a fake truce to keep the new Road 2 together to the 7, with John essentially agreeing to get rid of the other old Road 2s first, which plays a factor moving forward. But then out of nowhere, we get what is definitely probably the most icky moment of the entire season, where Rob just ends up outing John Carroll, which it's weird how this didn't seem to be a big deal at the time, where I don't feel you heard much about people calling Rob out for this, but this certainly would not have flown nowadays. And again, leaves a bitter taste in your mouths here with Rob, where again, this is just a massive dick thing to do. Though I will say that I do think the Rob that is on this season is not the Rob that we know nowadays. And I think the modern day Rob would certainly not do something like this. And I do think he has matured over the last 20 years. But Rob's casual homophobia on this season has certainly not aged well, and definitely does leave an icky taste in your mouth, especially considering how prominent of a figure he is on this season. But now on Maraamu, we do end up seeing them predict that either Rob or Sean were the ones voted out, only for them to be shocked at the reward challenge where they find out it was Gabe that was voted out. And a lot of the screen time moving forward is about how much they miss Gabe and how Pascal looked at him as a son. And really, as a whole, I do feel like John Carroll voting out Gabe here was a mistake, where through doing so, he does end up putting some doubt in Pascal and Naliah's minds, while also keeping Rob around, who is someone that is a major antagonistic figure for him, and one that throws him under the bus at every opportunity. But the reward challenge itself was actually a pretty fun one, which you can rarely say about old school Survivor, where it was a really close race. And while Road 2 does end up finishing first, after Kathy and Gina forget to bring their flag to the finish, Road 2 ends up getting DQ'd for their boat not being far enough on shore, and the general not even being there at the finish line. So Maraamu ends up winning instead. Now, before the immunity challenge, we do see Rob essentially know that it's a do or die situation for him, and John ends up wanting to actually throw the challenge here to vote out Rob, and tries to convince Tammy to do so. Which, again, it's interesting to see the concept of throwing challenges being pretty prominent in old school Survivor. We saw it in Africa. We're obviously seeing it now. Though it doesn't end up happening here, as Rob ends up leading the tribe here to winning the challenge, which ends up being the only immunity challenge he participates in this entire season that he ends up winning, which is kind of ironic considering his overall track record in tribal challenges moving forward, which is very impressive. But at this point, it is pretty clear that Gina is going home, and she doesn't even really try to save herself. I mean, she really just banks on her being closer to Pascal and Naliah than Kathy, which was not optimal play here. And really, no one on the tribe outside of Kathy wants to even talk about the vote, which pretty much matches what you would expect from the people that were on this tribe. But by the time we get to tribal, Naliah does openly talk about her changing her mind constantly, which is also just suboptimal play. I mean, really making it clear to Kathy that she was wavering here, but it doesn't end up backfiring on her, and Gina ends up being voted out here. And let's talk about Gina, who, again, had the largest edit for a pre-merge boot in the history of the show. But despite that, I actually don't find Gina that memorable. I mean, she wasn't that interesting of a player to me on this season, especially considering she spends a lot of her screen time just talking about how lazy her original tribe is. And while she does do a good job at bonding with her new swap tribe, I mean, she ends up playing way too passively over the course of the season to really make any impacts gameplay wise. I mean, by the end of her run, she is likable, but I feel like a large portion of that is just due to how much screen time she was given to get us to know her, despite the fact that I do think the cast had a number of other more interesting figures that they could have given more screen time to. But with that, we're here at episode 7, the merge episode, where right away we get some pretty insignificant content from both Kathy and Rob. But we follow that up with the tribes being told to send one player on a mission, and unsurprisingly, those are the two that go on the mission. And the fact that the Road 2 tribe actually lets Rob go on this trip, to which, I mean, like, he obviously volunteered as he has nothing to lose, but there was no benefit for Road 2 to let him go here, and there was so much potential downside that it's mind-blowing that they let him do it. But either way, I mean, Rob and Kathy become the ambassadors to the merge, where they get to talk while having pizza and beers. And we do get this like really awkward flirtation between the two, where Rob talks about seeing another Sarah in Kathy, which is not the route that you expected this talk to go. But Rob really takes advantage of this situation, using this as an opportunity to flip Kathy to his side and throwing Zoe in particular under the bus, talking about the deal that the new Road 2 made and that Zoe is now targeting her. Rob and Kathy also make a deal together to keep each other safe. And really, I feel like overall this was decent work on Rob's end. I mean, even though it doesn't end up saving him, I do think this at least gave him some openings moving forward. Though, again, like his runway was pretty much done at this point, especially considering how much Gina threw him under the bus along the way. But I do think this overall also ends up boosting Kathy's game as well, with her now not being blindly loyal to the Road 2 tribe moving forward and recognizing that she needs to shake things up to progress within the game. But after that, we do get the formal merge where the general is upset that the merge buff is pink, so I mean, that's something. But we do instantly see Kathy trying to work on Pascal to get him to flip, but is unsuccessful in doing so. We do also see Rob and Zoe get into a confrontation again, with it being pretty clear that Kathy had told Zoe about what Rob had told her, and Zoe does her typical thing of acting oblivious to the concept of her being in any alliances, which is, again, not a great look considering the majority of people there know that she's in the Road 2 4 and did make these agreements. But this leads to Kathy talking about how she doesn't know who to believe and that she needs immunity, and unsurprisingly, we get to the first immunity challenge after merge, and she wins it. Now, the challenge does have a notable moment from Rob, where despite him knowing that he is the target, he decides to play around and touch the water to splash people, which ends up DQing him. And this is a really asinine move for his game, and I know Bus Rob himself has talked about this moment more recently as like a sign of his immaturity at the time. But after the challenge, we do get what is essentially the end of the Rob-John rivalry storyline, where Rob, again knowing he has nothing to lose, decides to confront John along with Sean, and we get this pretty iconic scene in my eyes where they're fighting over John breaking their deal, though I mean obviously Rob was planning on breaking their deal too. But I do think this definitely harmed John's reputation moving forward. But by the time of Tribal, again, it's pretty clear Rob is going home here, and I was surprised to see Rob not really fight to stay that hard at Tribal, Though I guess looking back on it, it wasn't that prominent of a thing at this point in Survivor history. But here we do find out about the twist of the season, that the immunity winner can now hand their immunity necklace to another player, which never comes into play this season, really shouldn't ever come into play. Though obviously this is a very important rule change that will lead to a couple notable moments in future seasons. But we do get to the vote where Rob is clearly getting voted out there, to which we get a great smirk from John immediately afterwards. Kathy does end up sticking to her word in voting for Zoe, and Vespia ends up joining the Road 2s to vote for Rob, which I know people give Vespia a lot of credit for this, when in reality it's really a nothing move in my eyes. I mean, yes, she does a good job at making her the last on the pecking order for Madaramu, but I mean, that's pretty much it. I mean, all the work that she does with the Road 2s here just ends up getting her 8th place, had the flip not happen. And to be honest, this style of vote is such an obvious move and a very minimal one that, again, I just don't give her that much credit for doing it. I mean, we had already seen T-Bird do it in the previous season and voting out Frank. And again, it ends up leading to pretty much nothing there. And to me, this like voting out your ally to manage your perception is like mostly a nothing move in most situations. And while it does avoid you from harming your game even more so, I don't think it ever actively benefits someone in the game of Survivor to where they come out of a round like this in a better position than what they were before that tribal. But anyway, let's finally get around to talking about Boston Rob here, who is an incredible character on this season. Again, like, it's obviously tainted by the ickiness. Outside of that, I do think Boston Rob played the game in a way that we hadn't seen up until this point. I mean, he had a very aggressive gameplay style that was fun to see, but also was a fun character with him being so good at talking to the camera and really giving his raw and cutting confessionals along the way. Obviously, he does come back for All Stars, and from that point on, he ends up being one of the most iconic figures in the history of the show. And I know a lot of people say that his All-Star spot was unwarranted, and I do tend to disagree, as I really can't imagine the pre-merge of this season without Boston Rob. Now, do I think that maybe a certain other person from this cast should have been on instead? Maybe. But the fact that Rob was on All-Stars at all is not that big of a surprise in my eyes. Now for episode 8, which is one of the most iconic episodes in the history of the show, largely due to this episode having the first ever flip against a majority alliance after the merge, which does change the way the game is played, at least by the time of the Survivor of the Amazon. But I will say personally, while I do think this episode is very significant in the history of the show, I do find the episode itself kind of meandering. I mean, the episode does start off with Vespia getting to explain why she voted for Rob, which again is another strong point for her edgically. But then we follow that up with a segment about Sean being gassy, which they use as a way to set up Sean being the target here, which is just kind of weird. Kathy and Zoe end up talking again, and Zoe continues to lie to her for no reason. We get the iconic kite flying reward challenge that Kathy ends up winning, and really all this is just kind of lame, especially considering the reward itself is a deep sea dive, which is just kind of boring to watch. But then also the only food she gets is a Snickers bar, which she ends up sharing with the entire tribe anyway. So that just felt pointless. Before the challenge, we do have Jeff giving everyone a taste of Snickers, to which we have this really awkward moment where Zoe bites at Jeff's fingers. But again, all of this is just really weird. After the challenge, we do see the start of the campaigning to make this flip happen, where we do see Sean telling V that he's going to talk to Kathy and Naliah. We have Sean and Kathy both seeming to be fully on board with the plan pretty much instantly. And really all comes down to Naliah and Pascal, to where we do see Kathy approaching them, and Naliah does seem to be receptive to the plan, while Pascal just outright refuses to flip, as he doesn't want to work with Sean and V. And I will say that Pascal throughout this season definitely displays a lot of microaggressions through the way he treats V and especially Sean throughout this season. But later on, we do follow this up with Pascal and John having a conversation where Pascal gives John his word that he will not flip and that he wants to guarantee that Sean doesn't get to the end of the game, which, again, his hatred for Sean here really comes out of nowhere. But following this, we do get a great confessional from John where he talks about how he's happy that Naliah and Pascal are supporting his success and are rooting for him in the game, which is really a ridiculous confessional for him to be giving. But then we get to one of the most iconic immunity challenges in the history of the show, the Coconut Chop Challenge, which ends up working out for this season as it does blatantly display the pecking order. But I will say that I do think this was and always will be a terrible choice for an immunity challenge, where the people at the bottom have no chance at winning immunity here, which is the entire point of having an immunity challenge. I mean, it would have worked a lot better as a reward challenge, as here it essentially just hands immunity to someone in the majority, where in most situations it won't end up affecting the results. But even then, I mean, like, people do say that, oh, the Road to 4 played poorly here because they made the pecking order so obvious. But to me, that isn't the issue with the Road to 4 and how they played it here. Because while Sean, V, and Kathy are the first three to go, that really doesn't matter. Because at the end of the day, it is Pascal and Naliah that are the main figures here that decide this vote and are the main ones that need to get flipped over. And if you pay attention to the rest of the boot order, it isn't really indicative of the true pecking order, where John is the next one out, and then Pascal, and then Zoe before Naliah. Naliah gets the 3 here against Tammy and the General, where those two do end up getting the 2, and Tammy ends up winning the challenge. But to me, it wasn't the boot order here that was really important, but more so the attitude of the Road to 4, where they do act pretty cocky the entire way. And that does lead to Pascal and Naliah being bothered by their arrogance, which even then, I don't think that actually ends up affecting Pascal at all, where like Pascal still seems to be fully on board with going forward with the rest of the Road Twos. And this is where I do actually have to give Naliah a lot of credit for this flip, where I do feel like Naliah was the one to actually make this move happen and get Pascal to flip. And I think she's the only one that could have gotten Pascal to flip. I don't think he does it under the command of any other player in the game, and I do think if Naliah didn't fight as hard as she did for it, I don't think it would have happened. Now, of course, you do have to give Kathy some credit for the move as well, with her being the first one to approach Naliah. And I'm sure Sean and V were doing stuff in the background as well, though again, they weren't really shown in the show as much, especially V. But I'm at the point now where if I were to give sole credit for this move to one individual person, I would personally give it to Naliah. But I will say that something I do find disappointing about this episode is that I feel like we do miss a lot of the scrambling after the challenge, where we do see Pascal and Naliah talk, but outside of that, we don't see much outside of Pascal still not wanting to make the move. And that is a major element of why I don't hold this episode in as high regard as others, is because I don't feel like the episode actually properly shows the events up until the vote out. Where again, like, we see nothing from V's perspective over the course of this episode. Sean and Kathy, we see nothing from them after the early portions of the episode. We never actually see Naliah fully pull Pascal over, and eventually by the time of the vote, Zoe ends up voting for John as well, which comes out of left field and is never explained. So to me, like, this is an episode that just has a lot of wasted potential, and us just not really being shown a lot of the stuff that was going on during this round. But when we get to the vote, I mean, we do get an iconic voting confessional from Sean as he votes out John Carroll, and John ends up being voted out in a 6-3 vote. And also has some pretty notable words as well, where he's crying and apologizing to his mom. But with that, let's talk about John, who I love on this season. I mean, John Carroll has such a fantastic downfall over the course of this season, with him being a villain that has, again, like a fun downfall edit, but is also not a despicable villain. I mean, yes, he does play hard and gets way too cocky towards the end of his game, but he doesn't do anything that bad and doesn't really come off as hypocritical throughout the season, with him actually telling the truth more so than he lies. And in situations where he's confronted, he openly admits to his lying and makes it known to others what alliances he's in. I mean, to me, he is a really interesting figure in Survivor history that I really can't believe we haven't seen back at this point. I mean, especially considering how much he wants to play again. I mean, to me, he is such an iconic figure that the way that he ends up going home is a major lesson moving forward on not getting too cocky in the game. And due to how iconic his vote out was, I do feel like he's someone that would be very interesting to see have a redemption arc on a return. Now let's move on to episode 9, where the season does slow down a bit gameplay wise, as we do get a bit of a begonging here with Zoe, Tammy, and the General now being at the bottom. But there are still some notable moments along the way. I mean, the opening scene to this episode is really great, where we see the newly formed majority celebrating under the waterfall and singing Brand New Day. But again, this 5 does end up holding together until the final 5. And when you get talk from Pascal about how he flipped because he didn't want to be with manipulative people in the game, which, I mean, fine, I guess. Again, like, he talks about how truthful he is when he literally just told John in the previous episode that he was safe and then proceeds to vote him out, but whatever. We do get a lot of content from Tammy here, with her now being the main target, where she does try to get Zoe back on board with her and the General, but Zoe just outright says that they weren't in an alliance and that they were in a loose friendship, and she just outright says that she doesn't like her, saying she doesn't like her eyes or her presentation, which, again, like, this is terrible gameplay from Zoe here. Like, I get what she's trying to do in the sense that she's trying to disassociate herself with Tammy, but she's saying this to Tammy when they're alone. Like, this is insane. Or again, like, if this was like in front of the entire camp, fine, I guess. Especially considering how big of a target Tammy is at this point. But you're alone with Tammy. There's no reason to go this hard against her in that situation. But after this, we do get a somewhat notable reward where people are randomly paired, and Sean and Pascal are the winning pair here. And to see these two who have nothing in common, and again, Pascal just outright seems to hate Sean for a lot of the season. To see them have a bit of a bonding moment was nice to see. I mean, the reward itself was also fun, with Sean struggling to ride a horse. And we had a few awkward moments that are pretty notable along the way, though I will say that the reward itself probably takes a bit too much time here on the episode. The immunity challenge is also a pretty notable one, where they have to walk on stilts, and like pretty much no one can do it outside of Tammy. And through that, Tammy ends up beating everyone pretty easily here, wins immunity, narrowing down the field to Zoe and the General, where Tammy and the General end up trying to flip over Pascal and Naliah by throwing John under the bus, but Pascal ends up turning it down because they weren't sincere. And this ends up causing some pretty poor play from the General, where he just walks away from the conversation like really grumpily and starts rubbing people the wrong way, and that puts a pretty big target on his back, while Zoe decides to make jewelry for the tribe in order to fit in, and that just felt extremely transparent. But by the time we get to the vote, I mean, the vote does seem to come down to physical strength, to where they considered Zoe a better competitor, and through that she is voted out unanimously. And Zoe is such a bizarre figure within Survivor history. Again, a player that wouldn't own up to her game while on the island, and a lot of her content is people calling her out for playing the game and her just not ever owning up to it. I mean, Zoe is someone that got a pretty minimal edit here. I mean, definitely the smallest edit out of anyone that made the merge up to this point in Survivor history. I mean, she ends the season with only 5 confessionals, and is one of these figures that most of her screen time is other players talking about her, more so than her actually getting to talk. She has so many awkward moments over the course of the season as well, with her exit where she says strength and honor, and then numerous other weird moments I've talked about along the way. Again, like, I really don't know what to make of her on this show, as again, I just feel like she's just a weird figure in the history of the series. But now for episode 10, which was another slower episode. I mean, we do start off by seeing more of the Sean and Vespia relationship, with Sean giving her mango to celebrate their birthday. And they do celebrate in secret, which I do think was a pretty good move for Sean and Vespia to try to hide their relationship, even though, again, not super effective in that grand scheme of things. We do also get a notable reward here, where the challenge mostly revolves around swimming, and Sean does get a Suri-esque moment of him getting like heroic music as he gets through the first round, though he is promptly eliminated next. And surprisingly, Pascal ends up winning the final round, where they have to carry this like heavy stone to shore. And he gets to take someone with him, and he does end up taking Naliah, to where they go on a cruise where they get this luxurious dinner. And Pascal does say a ridiculous line here, saying that Naliah is the epitome of a young woman that deserves it. But this does end up irritating Sean, who really wanted him to pick V for her birthday. And during the dinner itself, I mean, they really try to pretend like they're using Jeff Probst's credit card, and Pascal ends up giving like a $200 tip, which, again, like, all this just feels dumb. Naliah has a notable moment on the return here, as they didn't end up bringing any food to share with the tribe as they had done on previous rewards, but Naliah ends up offering them a mint that was already in her mouth. And like, you would think that, oh, this is like a joke, right? But no, she's actually like dead serious in this and is actually like trying to get people to take her mint, which is just ridiculous. And like, even the next day, like, we get a scene of like Naliah and Pascal just joking around in front of camp about the reward, which just felt like bad social play there. And like, throughout this episode, Sean gets a lot of content about how annoyed he is at Naliah, which plays a factor later on in the episode. The general then gets some content where he seems out of his rut from the previous episode, and he goes hunting for a pig so that he can use it as leverage to stay, where he literally tells Tammy to go win immunity so that she's safe, and then he can find a pig so that they can both stay. Again, like, him and John Carroll, I guess, have the same philosophy in the game, because obviously that's how Survivor works. I mean, you find a pig, you stay in the game, obviously. But eventually the general himself ends up winning immunity instead here, and Tammy is the clear target. I mean, while we do get talk from V and Sean about flipping to take out Naliah, it does end up going through, though it was nice to see them think about making this move. As again, at the point of the game that we're at right here, this is actually a really interesting dynamic where we're left in the game with like 3 separate pairs. And this easily could have been the first display of voting blocks in the history of the show. But as I mentioned, Tammy does end up getting voted out here unceremoniously. And again, I really like Tammy on this season. I mean, to me, I did come out of this rewatch pretty high on Tammy as a player. I mean, she does seem to be strong in all 3 facets of the game. And had the Road to 4 remained in power, I do think Tammy would have had a high likelihood of winning the game. As a character, I mean, she's fine. I mean, she really doesn't do much of note until her final tribal speech. But again, like, I don't think she does anything bad either. I mean, she just seemed to understand that it was a game and that she was going to have to lie. And it's really just overall just kind of like a middle of the road character on the season. But overall, I found her to be likable enough in most aspects of the game. And had this been around the time of Survivor All-Stars, I wouldn't have been opposed to seeing a Tammy return. Now for episode 11, again, another dull episode that continues the pagonging, where we do get the family visit, the first in-person one in the history of the show, where all previous ones involve like videos from home or messaging them online, but here the loved ones were there in person, and most of them are pretty forgettable, though Pascal and his wife get a lot of focus here, which is really ironic if you know what happened to Pascal after the show. But here the loved ones themselves are the ones that play in the challenge, which Kathy's son Patrick ends up winning, and he gets to spend a day at camp, which doesn't feel like that good of a reward, especially for Patrick. And we do get some fun from him clearly not wanting to be there, and we do get some interesting scenes between Kathy and Pat where she wants to like run through her strategy, and he's again just not interested in it and tells her that he doesn't like this side of her. But we do hear her clearly thinking about flipping against Pascal and Naliah and her trying to partner up with the general, which would have been her ideal move here. And while she can't really bank on the general remaining like super loyal to her, I do think it would have given her more options moving forward than the path that she does end up taking. Now, V does end up winning immunity in this episode, and in the back half of the episode, again, like the plan doesn't end up coming together to flip on Pascal and Naliah, and there's not really an explanation of why. I do suspect that the general just really had no relationship with Sean and V, and to get him to flip over to vote out Pascal or Naliah was just not really realistic. And with Naliah and Pascal not even considering flipping, I mean, it does cause the general to go home here pretty unceremoniously, despite, again, like a potential flip being flown around. But with that, I mean, let's talk about the general, who, I mean, to me is a notable figure from this season, but I can get why he's probably pretty forgettable in the grand scheme of things. I mean, for some reason, I just find him to be a humorous figure here, despite him not actually even doing that much. I mean, just the fact that he goes around and calls himself the general, despite, to my knowledge, him never being in the military, is just a weird character trait there. He does also seem to have a level of game sense to where he at least vocalizes that he is using John as a meat shield, and seemed to be in a decent position had the Road to 4 gotten to the end together. But really, he didn't seem like an overly strategic player and seemed to be a pretty passive one. So really, I mean, there's not much of an explanation of why I actually like the general as a character here, especially considering he was a bit under-edited throughout the season as well. But I don't know, to me, he always came off as a humorous figure. But now for episode 12, where we finally have the majority 5 getting to the end here and having to turn against each other. And right away, the entire round is essentially summarized by Kathy, with her being the swing and her having to pick between two sides. We have Sean and V and Pascal and Naliah. And the battle between the two sides is really fun on paper, though it did seem like the two sides took things a bit personally, and that wasn't great. We do see Sean and V make the campaign that they aren't even that close, which always felt ridiculous to me. And they try to make the argument that, again, they're only being perceived as close because they're the two black people in the game. And while I do think that is a thing early on in the game, that definitely played a factor, I do think it's ridiculous that they're trying to claim this at the final 5, where they're the only 2 remaining Maramu members. They voted together, every vote with the exception of the Rob vote out, and have clearly bonded over the course of the season, particularly around their religion as well. And it's like, again, to me, it just feels ridiculous that they're even trying to claim that they're not close. But then we do see Naliah and Pascal being upset that they are campaigning this way, which is also not a great look from their end either, especially with, like, again, Pascal's microaggressions coming out once again throughout this episode. We then have the entire tribe coming together to discuss in the open over who to vote out, where we get a lot of, like, really arbitrary arguing over who has a deal and who doesn't. And again, this is all just semantics. This is something that earlier I mentioned with, like, Zoe, where it's like the players on the season really get so hung up on whether there's, like, a formal alliance or not. Like, it's such an arbitrary fact when, like, again, you have a mutual understanding that you are going to be working together. It doesn't matter if you ever called it an alliance or if you ever officially made a deal. You are working together. You do want to take each other further into game. You do explicitly trust each other to where you are more than likely going to strive to get to the end together. Again, it doesn't matter if you formally made an alliance, if you formally made a deal. Yet they just really get so hung up on this over the course of the season. And really, like, again, all this arguing is just so dumb, where we have, like, Pascal getting upset at V for thinking that him and Naliah have a deal, only for him to later admit to him and Naliah having an agreement. We have Sean, again, getting upset that Pascal and Naliah are assuming that him and V are close. Though, again, he admits that they have a close bond. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to go against each other. Which, again, like, all this is just so dumb. And I feel like it's actually insulting to Kathy that they're both, like, trying to play off as they're not close, when literally everyone in the game can tell that both of these pairs are very, very close. But either way, I mean, Kathy has a very tough decision to make here, where each side has their pros and cons. I mean, both lead to her getting to 3, where she needs final immunity. So really, her choice comes down to who she thinks she can beat over who she thinks will keep her around, as again, neither of them are going to. Now, we do end up getting the car reward challenge in this episode, where Sean wins the challenge, adding him to the car curse, but also increases his threat level, which I do think definitely plays a factor coming into this vote. We do have Kathy winning the immunity challenge, which really gives her full reign over who to vote out here. And coming into Tribal, we do once again get a heated debate between Sean and Pascal, who get into argument again over who has a deal and who doesn't. Sean tries to make a deal with Kathy for her to give him the immunity necklace, and really, it just feels pretty clear that Sean was blatantly told that he was going home before Tribal, and that is why he goes so hard at Tribal here, trying to save himself. But for me, the vote did seem to come down to challenge strength, where I do think Kathy rightfully thinks that Sean and V are the more dangerous duo in challenges than Naliah and Pascal, especially with, like, Pascal, like, very clearly being close to being medevac at this point, meaning she would have an easier road to win immunity at 3. Now, I do think there's an argument that going to 4 with Sean and V is safer, as they are more likely to win immunity than Pascal. So that way she has a safer route to 3, to where all she would need is final immunity, to where in the route that she ends up going, obviously Vespia wins immunity, which puts her in danger at 4. But also, I think there's an argument that she makes the wrong move in voting out Sean here over Vespia, where, again, I think she votes out Sean because he is the biggest physical threat left in the game. But I do think the better move for her would have been to vote out Vespia, as I do think Vespia is someone that is more willing to work with Pascal and Naliah given certain circumstances than Sean, where I do think Sean would have been more loyal to Kathy under the same pretenses that Vespia was in, where I don't think Sean is making a deal at Final 3 to vote Kathy out of the game. Plus also, Sean is a bigger target to where I feel like there's no way that Pascal and Naliah are flipping on Kathy to get rid of Sean, to keep Sean around. So again, for me, I do feel like she makes a bit of a misstep on exactly who to target, though I do think she picks the correct side to go with. But with that, let's talk about Sean, who is an incredible character from this season. I mean, probably one that was well ahead of his time, especially with how much he brought forward talks about race and religion that Survivor typically tried to avoid for a while moving forward. I mean, he's also a solid player in his own right, definitely flawed. I'm probably too emotional at points and doesn't make the moves that he needs to make in the end game to position himself better, but I did like how he thought about the game at points. I mean, he does consider doing some flips here and there and does execute 2 major ones in the move against Hunter and John, but I did feel like he had some wasted opportunities, but even then, it did seem pretty clear that the Road 2s just didn't respect him. And I do think he would have had a tough road to win the game, even if he had gotten to the end, but is still an iconic character and someone that it's a travesty that we haven't seen him back on Survivor at this point. And now for the finale, which ends up being one of the strongest finales in the history of the show. I mean, there's so many iconic moments within this episode. We start off at the Final 4, which is a really notable round, but coming into it, I mean, Vespia is the clear target, and really the content up until the immunity challenge is pretty boring. But we do eventually learn that the immunity challenge will be fallen comrades, and Pascal wants everyone to compare notes, while V ends up holding back, and we get the reveal that she has an entire notebook filled with personal information about the other players. And this is really great strategy on her end. I mean, every season of the show up until this point has had a fallen comrades immunity challenge at some point, and for her to know that she needs to be gathering all this personal information about the other players is good strategy, and potentially does save her in the game this round. Though this is the final time we do see fallen comrades, as I mentioned in my Africa retrospective, I mean, that situation with Lex obviously caused them to be apprehensive about bringing it back, and then also I do feel like the V situation of her essentially breaking the competition does play a factor as well. But even despite the advantage that Vespia should have had here, it does end up being pretty close, where it comes down to the last question, and it would have been tied had Naliah known Sean's girlfriend's name. Now, another thing of note is that I do find it extremely dark that Boston Rob's explanation for him leaving was to join the army, again, like at a time where 9/11 had just happened. So I do think him lying about doing that seems pretty messed up, but again, Vespia ends up winning here. And with her safe for the round, we get a lot more intrigue here where Kathy really fights to save her game, where obviously Pascal and Naliah are now forced to vote for Kathy. And here we have Kathy instantly going to V to make a deal, which is obviously in both of their best interests at this point. But I do feel like most players in Survivor history up until this point would have just given up. But I did like seeing Kathy try to team up with Vespia here, and we do get some fun moments along the way where like Jeff tells them that we haven't discussed how a tie works after they talk about the tiebreaker being a quiz. Jeff also turns down Kathy's request for her and Vespia to be able to talk in private, which is kind of ironic considering how prominent live tribals have become in the modern day. We also have Kathy trying to campaign using Pascal being sick, which causes him to get upset at her. And all this deliberation is pretty fun, but we eventually get to the votes where it is a 2v2 between Kathy and Naliah, which means that this is the first time we're ever going to see the new tiebreaker of rocks, where the player that draws the purple rock here ends up going home, essentially leaving the game up to chance. And while this is iconic, being the first time we see this tiebreaker and the only time we see it up until Survivor Blood versus Water, I will say that I hate how rocks were handled here at the Final 4. And if you notice, by the time we have a Final 4 tie again, which is in Palau, the tiebreaker is changed to fire making. And that is what it should have been here as well. Though obviously I suspect that they didn't even think about it until then. But in general, rocks to me is a perfect tiebreaker. It forces the people who can't break the tie to now face elimination between them and it being down to random draw. So you have either someone flipping to avoid this random draw, which is fun, or you have the players putting their games up to chance, which is also a fun element here. The problem at 4, though, is that you can't implement that rule, as if you do so, then Pascal just automatically gets eliminated. So here they have to do rocks involving Kathy and Naliah as well, which does lessen the impact of the deadlock vote here to me. Now, when drawing the rocks, Pascal does joke around that his feels like purple. And what do you know? Pascal does draw the purple rock here and is eliminated. And I love the immediate scene where the players in the game are shocked and Kathy's just yelling out about how crazy the game is, only for us to then cut to the jury where they are just so stone-faced and just like not entertained, which I just find it pretty humorous. But let's talk about Pascal. And I will say I think this was the best case scenario for who went home here. And while Pascal is someone that on paper played a strong game in the sense that he was always in the majority, never got a vote against him, probably wins a jury vote against anyone but Kathy. But Pascal is someone that really just barely played the game and seemed to be fine with losing the game as long as he remained honorable, despite him not being that honorable. And to me, Pascal is a massive hypocrite over the course of this season and with his microaggressions along the way as well. And also the fact that he is also a massive hypocrite outside of the game. It really just makes him a bit of an icky character nowadays. And him leaving leaves us with a pretty fantastic final 3. So to me, I've never been that upset that Pascal got screwed over here, especially considering under a normal rocks situation, he technically gets taken out by default anyway. So I've never been that bothered by Pascal getting rocked out of the game. But with that, let's move on to the final 3, which again is also pretty boring up until the immunity challenge. Jeff arrives at camp to wake them up at 3 a.m. and they do a series of boring events like rowing to the other island. They get fake tattoos. They get a purification bath. We get a boring rites of passage where, again, in later seasons, we get these like reflective confessionals from the boots themselves, but here it's just like a boring montage of clips. But then we get to the immunity challenge, which is the classic hands-on hard idol challenge, which does have a really notable outcome here where Kathy talks about knowing that Naliah is mad at her and is going to vote her off, only for Naliah to eventually mention that Kathy's blouse is falling off, to where while Kathy is readjusting it, she ends up falling, and pretty much instantly V decides to make a deal with Naliah here. And this is really the main point of agency within V's game. And like Kathy making a deal with V in the previous round, I do like the concept of this move from V, and I feel like this is something that you wouldn't commonly see from older seasons. Though I do think V manages Kathy pretty poorly by making this move. But again, the thought of making this move and being this cutthroat is pretty impressive. Again, she ends up throwing the challenge to have Naliah vote out Kathy. And really, I think this move shows a killer instinct that V seemed to be lacking beforehand. Though again, I do think she burns her relation with Kathy along the way. She really nullifies the point of the move itself, where again, we had seen this move before with Hatch in Survivor Borneo, where I think he does it perfectly, where he throws immunity to have Kelly vote out Rudy so that he doesn't get the blood on his hands, essentially so that he gets to keep Rudy's jury vote. But the way that V does it here burns Kathy's jury vote along the way, which is obviously pretty suboptimal play there. Now we do get the tribal where we do find out that Pascal collapsed on his way there. And I do really love that they told John to give the players in the game an update. And he is clearly annoyed the entire time he is doing so. And that's just kind of funny. But again, at tribal, we do have this debate between Kathy and V where V just doesn't own up to the fact that she screwed Kathy over, which I really don't think is a good look to the jury. But Kathy does end up getting voted out here. And what is there to say about Kathy? I think she is clearly the biggest character on this season and was a player that was way ahead of her time. The way that she looks at the game here is way more individualistically than most of the players we have seen in the past. The problem was her endgame positioning, where again, no matter what she did, she always needed to win her final 3 immunity in order to get to the end. Maybe she could have flipped here and there and tried to get the general further, or maybe go to 3 with like Pascal and Sean, and through those scenarios she probably gets to the end where she probably wins. But again, like her winning the game without having to win final 3 immunity was always a narrow path. But despite that, again, she is a really notable character on this season, and again develops over the course of the season to where she starts off as this really domineering figure that had a tough time fitting in on row 2. and was probably going to be the first boot had they had gone to tribal, but then she ends up squeezing her way through to the merge, where she does a lot of impressive maneuvering along the way, ends up being one of the better players in the history to show up until this point, and ends up being the biggest lock to be on All-Stars after this season, which was a pretty nice redemption to see from her considering how rocky she started the season. But now it's down to the final two. We have Vespia versus Naliah. Again, the content before the final tribal is mostly boring, and I'll be honest, it actually doesn't get much better when we get the final tribal either. But I did like hearing from the jury members on the way there, which is something that certain older seasons do as well. But again, the final tribal itself is mostly mundane. Now, there is a rumor out there that they had to shoot final tribal twice because the producers were unsatisfied with the initial shooting of it, with it being pretty boring. But to be honest, it still comes off as mostly boring here. I do find it strange they started off with Tammy, who by far gives the most notable speech here, where she calls out their holier-than-thou attitudes and calls them hypocrites, says that they got greedy and that getting the jury wasn't enough for them, which, that part of it is a bit iffy. But I did like most of her speech. Pascal ends up saying a ridiculous, typical Pascal line of him saying, "You two are the epitome of what this great country has to offer," which, I guess. We do see the general in a denim vest and starts off by saying he has a question for both of you. Zoe talks about her work hard, play hard attitude. John has a fun energy when asking his questions as well. But the questioning itself was mostly mundane, and I do feel like both of them performed pretty poorly here, with, again, V not owning up to the move to get rid of Kathy, and I think through that completely burns her jury vote there. Naliah has a notable bad performance here where she comes in being in the advantage. She is someone that the old Rotus wanted to vote for, but she really just doesn't give them anything to work with. She comes off as very naive. She doesn't own up to her game while saying some pretty asinine things. Like, again, she doesn't start playing the game until day 24, which, again, is partially true, but don't say that to the jury. And John himself explicitly says that he came in wanting to vote for Naliah, but votes for V because Naliah didn't own up to her game. So V ends up getting the votes of the Rotu 4 minus Zoe. Zoe ends up voting for Naliah while saying that V is not for victory tonight, which is just hilarious considering obviously she's wrong. We end up having Sean obviously vote for Vespia, but again, even at Final Tribal, he keeps on talking about how his vote isn't locked in and that they're still not that close. But then, in his voting confessional, he literally says, "We did it." Again, it's just so dumb to me that they keep on pretending like they're not that close. After the voting, we do get this ridiculous scene of Jeff traveling back to the States. Really the first one of these, where he first rides on a helicopter, then he gets into a cab, and we have this bizarre scene where it's just silence as the cab driver is just staring back at Jeff. But eventually he gets to Central Park where the votes are revealed. And once again, before the votes are read, V still talks about how she didn't have an alliance with Sean and how they weren't that close, which is again, why? Again, I don't think they had a formal alliance, but again, very clearly they were very close. We literally saw the scene on TV of them celebrating her birthday in private. But who cares? Whatever. The votes are read. 4-3 vote. Vespia wins the game. Again, getting the votes of the Rotu 4 minus Zoe plus Sean, which I believe is an outcome that people were very surprised by back then. And even now, edgically, while V does get content at pretty integral times in the season, I do think her edit is a bit abnormal for a winner's edit, with there still being many points where I do wish we got to hear her thought process, because I do think there are points where she was clearly doing things, we just weren't shown what she was doing. And specifically that final 9 vote, the final 4, final 3, we don't really get to hear her inner dialogue on those rounds either. I do feel like there was just a lot of her game that is missing from the edit, which I do think is a common misconception with winners in general, that if they weren't shown, then people think that they were doing more than they actually were. But I do feel like with V, I do think V was doing more than what we were shown, and I do think that is an underwhelming element of how she was portrayed here. Now, I normally don't talk about reunion shows, and I would just go straight into talking about the final 2 players. However, I do feel like this reunion show is such a notable one that I might as well mention it here. where this is the final reunion show to not be hosted by Jeff Probst, and you can clearly tell why. Instead, we have Rosie O'Donnell as the host here, and this leads to a series of really awkward scenes that make for really bizarre television. I mean, she rides into the reunion show on a motorcycle with Colby, say farewell to Jeff, to which, if you pay attention, you actually see him taking the time to shake Boston Rob's hand on the way out, which is kind of weird. Rosie sings a parody of the Gilligan's Island theme song with the rest of the cast just clapping around her, which is bizarre. She tells Kathy that the best moment of the season was you peeing on him, which is humorous. We have Pascal saying, "You would die for literally anyone that you're out there with," which is like, I'm pretty sure you wouldn't. She calls Sarah the Kimmy of the season and says that she's happy Sarah brought her boobs with her, to which Rob later responds that he's happy Sarah brought her boobs too. And really, you can just tell how drunk Boston Rob is during this reunion. And there's also this like really awkward moment where he gives like Hunter a tissue along the way, and Hunter himself had also like lost his voice for the reunion that I'm pretty sure was due to all the partying they were doing beforehand. Rosie also says that Rob has a $1 million smile, so I mean, I guess she's a fortune teller in that sense. We also get talk about Pascal and his wife, which again is so awkward considering what happens postseason. And also bizarrely, like, Saturn ends up giving everyone a Saturn view. I mean, the car that Sean won earlier, meaning that, again, like, he now has two of them, I guess. But this entire segment's weird where, like, Rosie just yells out, "Saturn rules," in the middle of it, which is so weird. I mean, this entire reunion show is such a cluster F, but in such a humorous way that makes it really notable here. But with that, let's finally talk about the final two. I mean, first up, we do have Naliah, who again is an interesting player this season. Again, I've said I would give her the most credit for the flip against John Carroll. However, I do feel like that was pretty much the majority of her game. I mean, she straight up says that she doesn't play until day 24, and I actually don't think she was thinking strategically about the game up until the final 9 round there. And even after that, like, has a lot of social mistakes that end up costing her in terms of her perception within the game. She obviously gets bad luck on the rock draw, but wins final Muni and takes Vespia to the end, where she almost wins and could have won had she owned up to her game, but just doesn't, and really comes off as naive the entire way through. But outside of Vespia, like, I feel like she struggles to win a jury vote against most other people. I mean, maybe Sean she could have beaten, but I feel like almost everyone else she loses against for sure. But I will say that I would love to see Naliah play again in the modern day. I do feel like Naliah, 20 years later, now like married to kids, obviously having a lot more life experience, I feel like that's the sort of person that I would love to see play Survivor again. I mean, she was someone that was campaigning really hard to play again during the time of Survivor Second Chance. So again, she definitely wants to do it, and I would love to see it, though again, like, I don't think it's particularly likely. Though I do think a return from her would be pretty fun. And finally, let's talk about Vespia, who I still think is a massive mixed bag of a player. I mean, she does have a lot of natural game sense where she does try to bond with the row twos after the swap. I do like how she navigates through the final 2 rounds of the game, but I do think her game is riddled with passiveness and her not really being able to own up to her game. I mean, one with her alliance with Sean. Well, obviously, I do think there was a mutual agreement there to not go after each other. Again, was there a formal final 2? No, but again, there might as well have been. And the fact that she continues to deny that is annoying. I am also annoyed by the fact that she doesn't really own up to her move to take out Kathy. Where again, like, on paper, it's a great move, but her continuously trying to say that she never had a deal with Kathy is just annoying to me. I do also feel like she has good ideas at points, though she was mostly ineffective in making those things actually happen. Where I do think Rob and Sean did a lot more of the legwork in the early game, and I think Kathy did a lot more of the legwork in the end game. And outside of her moves at the final 4 and final 3, I mean, I think there's little agency you can really associate to her. And even then, even at final 4, I mean, it was Kathy that approached her first to work together. And like, yes, she does end up bonding with the new road twos, but even then, again, she's still 8th in their pecking order. It's not like she was someone that they were planning on taking very far into the game. And even at the very, very end, at Final Tribal, they wanted to vote for Naliah over her, but just didn't vote for Naliah because Naliah wasn't giving them anything, which I think is more indicative of Naliah's poor play than it is Vesepia's strong gameplay. So I do think this sentiment of Vespia being massively underrated is a bit too much for me. However, I do think she is a solid player. She is a very flexible player a very adaptable player, and I do think that is a strong element of her game. I do also think character-wise, she is way more interesting than Jeff gives her credit for. I think she has some pretty fun confessionals, especially early on in the season. And I just feel like in general, the edit just stopped showing her. And just in general, the edit just stopped showing her in the mid-game, and I really wonder why. Like, I really don't know if it's like, did she just like not give them as much from that point forward, or were they just like so obsessed with other people like Rob, Sean, and Kathy to give her the content that revolved around her? Like, it really is really weird, where again, it's very clear that she's doing things, just that they're not bothering to show it and giving that content to other people instead. But Vespia is someone that I would personally like to see play again. Like, I would like to see how she adapts to the modern game, as I do think she has a lot of potential to be a better player than what my current assessment of her is. But I do think based on the game that she played on this season, I don't personally assess her too highly. But there we go. I mean, with that is the entire season of Survivor Marquesas, which I can't believe this video is as long as it is. But again, it's way longer than my previous 20-year retrospectives. But I feel like a lot of that is because of how important of a season this is for the show, with it being the first to really demonstrate a more dynamic approach to the game, with this also having the first appearance of Boston Rob, who's one of the most important figures in the history of the show, who played a game well ahead of his time. And the same thing goes for Kathy, who also is a massive figure on this season, also someone that I do think changed the way the game was played as well, while also being a very memorable fallen angel figure on this season. You also have the relationship between Sean and Vespia, which I do think led to some interesting social issues that were talked about on the show. I mean, to me, this is a pretty groundbreaking season from both a gameplay and character standpoint, which is why I had so much to talk about with this season. But there we go, and that is my retrospective for Survivor Marquesas. Obviously expect one for Survivor Thailand later this year, and also expect a Marquesas player ranking at some point. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.